The heat was a physical thing, a heavy blanket woven from sunlight and red dust that settled on the soul. It pressed down on the canvas roof of the stagecoach, baked the leather seats, and turned the air inside the lurching compartment into a thin, breathless soup. Willa Hart felt it in her bones, a weariness that had little to do with the miles they had crossed. Her hands, clammy and tight, held the leather satchel on her lap as if it were the last solid object in a dissolving world. Inside it, the papers felt like a brand, a secret weight that was hers alone to carry. Across from her, an old cattleman named Jed Crow, whose gums were as bare as the plains outside, shifted his bony frame and squinted out the window. His eyes were pale blue and watery, but they missed nothing. He spoke around a silent chew of air. The sun is cooking the sense right out of folks. You mark me. Another hour of this and the lizards will be looking for shade. Willa offered a small, tired smile. She had been a schoolteacher once, in a life that felt like it belonged to another person. She had helped her mother teach letters and numbers in a cool, quiet room where the only dust came from chalk. That world was gone, burned away by fever and grief, leaving only this scorched landscape and a promise she had made to her dying husband. A promise contained in the satchel. The coach hit a rut, and she was thrown against the door, the satchel digging into her ribs. The other passengers, a pair of overdressed salesmen from back east, grumbled. Jed just braced himself with a practiced ease. Easy there, little lady, he mumbled. This road was not made for comfort. It was made for getting from one bad spot to a slightly better one. Hopefully. Willa straightened her bonnet, her gaze drifting to the window. The Arizona territory stretched out in every direction, a breathtakingly cruel vista of towering red mesas and shadowed canyons. It was a land of sharp edges and blinding light, a place that demanded everything from you and promised little in return. Somewhere ahead lay a settlement called Coyote Springs, a name that was whispered like a prayer in this dry country. It was the source of life, the reason ranches clung to existence and the reason the railroad, that great iron centipede, was pushing its way west with men like Silas McGraw clearing its path. McGraw's name was another weight in her satchel, a name connected to stolen maps and forged letters. Suddenly, the driver's shout was cut short by a sharp crack that was not a whip. The coach shuddered violently, throwing the salesman into a heap. Horses screamed, a sound of pure animal terror. Jed Crow was instantly alert, his watery eyes now hard and focused. "Get down," he ordered, his voice a low growl. "Now." Willa dropped to the floorboards, her heart hammering against her ribs. The satchel was pressed between her body and the dusty wood. Shouts erupted outside, rough and commanding. "Stop the coach! Throw down the box!" Another gunshot splintered the wood near the window. One of the salesmen whimpered. "We do not have anything," the driver yelled, his voice strained. "Just mail and passengers." "We are not here for the box," a new voice called out. "Closer now. We are here for the woman. The one with the satchel. Send her out." A cold dread washed over Willa, colder than any winter morning. This was not a random robbery. They knew. She looked at Jed, his face grim in the dim light. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The door was wrenched open, and a man wearing a dusty bandana over his face loomed in the opening, a pistol in his hand. His eyes, small and cruel, scanned the interior and fixed on Willa. "There you are. Hand over the bag, lady. Mr. McGraw sends his regards." The name, spoken aloud in the violent heat, confirmed her worst fears. This was not about money. It was about silence. It was about burying the truth contained in the papers she carried. She clutched the satchel tighter. "No," the man chuckled. A dry, ugly sound. "Have it your way." He reached for her, but before his fingers could touch her arm, a blur of motion erupted from the other side of the coach. A second figure, Also masked but moving with a silent, fluid grace the other man lacked, appeared as if from the very dust. He was taller, leaner, and in his hand was not a pistol, but a long, heavy knife. The first man had no time to react. There was a swift, brutal strike to his wrist, and his pistol clattered to the floor. A second blow, with the flat of the hand, sent him stumbling backward out of the coach. The whole encounter took less than 2 heartbeats. The newcomer's eyes, dark and intense above his own mask, met Willa's for a fleeting second. They held no malice, only an unnerving calmness. He did not speak. Outside, the situation devolved into chaos. The other highwaymen, surprised by this new arrival, started firing wildly. The second masked man ducked back out of the coach, moving with the land, using the wheels and the terrified horses as cover. Willa could hear grunts, the thud of bodies hitting the hard-packed earth. It was a fight, but it was not a gunfight. It was something more primal. Jed pulled her further down. "Stay low. That one. He is different." A stick of dynamite, fuse hissing, landed near the front wheels of the coach. The driver and guard, who had been pinned down, scrambled for their lives. The second masked man was already pulling at the harness of the lead horses, his knife flashing as he cut the leather traces. He slapped their rumps, and the freed animals bolted into the desert scrub. He reappeared at Willa's door, his movements economical and urgent. "You must come now," he said. His voice was low and steady, without the rough accent of the others. There was no time to question, no time to think. The hissing fuse was a serpent promising death. She grabbed her satchel, and his strong hand closed around her forearm, pulling her from the coach and into the blinding sun. He half dragged, half carried her away from the road, toward the jagged opening of a narrow canyon. Behind them, the dynamite exploded with a deafening roar, shattering the air and sending splinters of wood flying. The coach, their only connection to civilization, was now a wreck of smoking timber. They ran. Willa had never known such exhaustion, such terror. Her lungs burned. Her city shoes slipped on the loose rock, but the man's grip was iron. He knew the terrain, weaving through cactus and sharp-edged boulders as if born to it. He was Navajo. She realized, Dine, the people. His moccasins made no sound on the stone. He moved not like a man fighting the land, but like a part of the land itself. They did not stop until the sun began to dip below the mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. He finally led her to a shallow overhang, a scooped-out hollow in the red rock that offered some concealment. Willa collapsed against the cool stone, her body trembling, gasping for air. The satchel was still clutched in her hand. He stood watching her for a moment, his posture relaxed but ready. He was waiting. When she finally caught her breath, she looked up at him. "Who are you? Why did you help me?" He reached up and slowly pulled the bandana from his face. His features were strong, carved from the very rock that surrounded them. High cheekbones, a firm jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed to hold the shadows of the canyon. He was young, perhaps her own age, but his expression was ancient with a kind of watchful gravity. "My name is Kai Benali. He said, I was not there to help you. I was there for what you carry." Willa instinctively pulled the satchel closer. "The men who attacked us. They said Silas McGraw sent them. They wanted this too." Kai nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know. I have been watching them. Watching the men who survey for the new railroad. They work for McGraw. They speak of a woman from the east carrying papers that could cause them trouble. I thought they were land deeds, but a robbery on an open road is loud. Too loud for men who prefer to work in shadows. It was a trap, designed to fail." She stared at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "They would attack the coach. You would refuse to give them the bag, and then a posse led by their man, Lieutenant Rourke, would ride in to save the day. They would find the bodies of their own men, maybe shoot one to make it look real. You would be arrested, accused of being their accomplice, of stealing the very papers you carry. The satchel and its contents would disappear into an evidence locker, and Silas McGraw would be free to do as he pleased. The cold dread returned. Colder this time because it was laced with the chilling logic of truth. It all made sense. The clumsiness of the attack. The specific demand for her in the satchel, it was a perfectly constructed lie. "But you stopped them," she whispered. "Your presence complicated their plan," he said simply, turning his attention to the satchel. He held out his hand. "Let me see them." Willa hesitated. This man was a stranger, an outlaw himself in the eyes of the law. He had fought and perhaps killed men today, but he had also saved her life. Looking into his steady gaze, she saw no greed, only a deep, unsettling seriousness. Slowly, she unbuckled the leather flap and drew out the folded papers. Her husband, a cartographer for the government before his illness, had spent his last months compiling this: maps of water tables, letters from a penitent surveyor, sworn affidavits, proof. Kai took the topmost document, a detailed map of the Coyote Springs Basin. He unfolded it carefully. His finger traced the lines showing the underground aquifers, the lifeblood of this entire region. Then he saw it. In the bottom corner of the map, pressed into the paper, was the official seal of the Coyote Springs Territorial Office, and beside it, the unmistakable, forged signature of a land commissioner who had been dead for 2 years. His expression hardened. "The spring, this is about the water." "Of course it is about the water," Willa said, her voice gaining strength. "McGraw is using fraudulent claims to seize control of the entire watershed. He means to sell the rights to the railroad and leave everyone else, your people, the small ranchers, with nothing but dust." Kai folded the map and handed it back to her. His movements deliberate. The red dust of their flight had settled on the paper, a fine powder like dried blood. He looked past her, toward the darkening plains. A muscle worked in his jaw. For the Navajo, water was more than survival. It was dignity. It was sacred. The land and the people were one, and the water was the blood they shared. McGraw was not just stealing resources. He was trying to sever a soul. "I am wanted now," Willa said, the reality of her situation settling in. "They will be hunting me." Kai's gaze sharpened, looking out from their hiding place into the deep twilight. He was silent for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the desert night. Willa followed his gaze and saw it then, far in the distance. A pinprick of light, then another, and another, a line of them, like malevolent fireflies, cutting a path across the darkness. "Torches! Rourke's posse," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They are faster than I expected. They will have trackers. We cannot stay here." The conflict was plain on his face. She was an outsider, a white woman. Her fight was not his. Helping her meant bringing McGraw's wrath, and the United States Army's, down upon his own community. But the evidence she held in that satchel, the truth sealed with a dead man's name, was a weapon that could protect his people, if they could live long enough to use it. The torches drew nearer, a moving wall of fire and men, sweeping the land. He looked at her, then at the vast, dangerous wilderness ahead. The choice had been made for them both. "We go now," he said, already moving. "Through the canyons. Pray the moon stays hidden." The night offered no mercy. It was not a soft blanket of darkness, but a landscape of sharp-edged shadows and treacherous footing. Kai moved through it like a ghost, his feet finding purchase on the loose scree and broken rock as if he could read the ground with his senses alone. For Willa, it was a stumbling agony. Her thin shoes were shredded, her ankles ached, and every breath was a painful rasp in her throat. The distant, bobbing lights of the posse were a constant threat, a pack of hounds on their trail. Their shouts carried faintly on the dry wind. He never spoke, only paused to let her catch her breath in the deep shadow of a rock outcropping, his presence a silent insistence to keep moving. They climbed until the canyons gave way to the broad, flat shoulders of a mesa, tucked into a deep crease at its base. Hidden from any casual eye was a small, temporary camp. A single hogan, built of earth and juniper logs, blended so perfectly with the landscape that Willa did not see it until they were almost upon it. A small, smokeless fire glowed near the entrance, casting a warm, flickering light on the face of an old woman who sat grinding corn with a stone mano and metate. Her face was a beautiful map of a long life, a web of deep lines etched by sun and wisdom. Her eyes, dark and bright as polished obsidian, held no surprise as she watched them approach. She simply nodded, her steady rhythm at the grinding stone unbroken. "This is my grandmother, Sheila," Kai said, his voice softer than Willa had yet heard it. The old woman looked at Willa, her gaze taking in the torn dress, the exhausted face, the fear that still lingered in her eyes. She spoke in her own language, a sound like water flowing over smooth stones. Kai translated. "She says you have run from a fire, but you carry a fire of your own inside you. You must be careful it does not consume you." Sheila gestured for Willa to sit. She offered her a gourd of cool water, the most precious gift in this land, and a piece of flatbread, warm and tasting faintly of smoke and corn. The simple act of kindness was so overwhelming that Willa felt tears well in her eyes. She had been running on nothing but fear for what felt like an eternity. Later, inside the hogan, the air thick with the scent of herbs and clean earth, Willa finally opened the satchel again. She laid the papers out on a worn blanket, the stark lines of the maps and the dense script of the letters looking alien in the soft firelight. Kai sat opposite her, his expression unreadable, while Sheila watched from the shadows, her hands now busy weaving a small basket. "My husband was a good man," Willa began, her voice quiet. "His name was Arthur. He did not understand greed. He understood lines and numbers, the way the world was meant to be ordered. He worked for the Territorial Survey. When he was sent to map this basin, he found things that did not make sense. Water rights assigned to men who did not exist. Claims filed with the signatures of officials long dead. He saw the pattern before anyone else did. Silas McGraw was not buying land. He was stealing the water beneath it, piece by piece, on paper." She paused, touching a letter with a faint tremor in her fingers. The fever took Arthur quickly. In his last weeks, he was obsessed. He gathered all of this, every last piece of proof. He made me promise. He said the truth had to have a voice, even if his was gone. So I came. I thought if I could just get these papers to the territorial governor, someone would listen. Kai picked up one of the forged documents. Studying the false signature Willa had pointed out, he now understood the quiet fury that drove this woman. It was not a quest for vengeance, but for honor, a promise to the dead. "You walk a dangerous path for a piece of paper and a memory," he said, though there was no judgment in his tone. "It is more than that," Willa insisted, looking from him to Sheila. "It is about what is right. Your people, the ranchers, everyone has a right to be here, to live. McGraw wants to own the one thing that makes life possible. That is not order. It is a sickness." Sheila said something from her corner. "My grandmother says you speak of Hozo," Kai translated, a slight reverence in his voice. "It means balance, beauty, harmony, to live in the right way with the land and with each other. A man like McGraw has no Hozo. He walks in chaos and creates it wherever he goes." The next day, news from the outside world found them. Kai had disappeared before dawn, and when he returned, his face was grim. He had met a rider in a hidden wash, a place of silent agreement. "Lieutenant Rourke has put a price on your head," he told Willa. "He is telling everyone you are the leader of a gang of thieves, that you conspired with the Navajo to rob the stagecoach. They are not just hunting you anymore. They are hunting all of us." The news landed like a stone in Willa's stomach. Her quest for justice had now endangered the very people she sought to help. The weight of her promise felt heavier than ever. The rider was from Ada Morales, Kai continued. She runs the trading post in the settlement. She says McGraw is not waiting. His men are preparing to drive the first stakes for the railroad spur. They will cut a channel directly through the heart of Coyote Springs. In 7 days, the spring will belong to the railroad. It will become a private pumping station. 7 days, the words hung in the air. A death sentence for the land. Willa felt a wave of despair. What could she do? She was a fugitive. The law was actively hunting her. To flee now, to save herself, would mean letting McGraw win. It would mean Arthur's death, and his life's final work would be for nothing. To stay meant almost certain capture or death. That evening, as she sat watching the impossible colors of the sunset paint the mesas, Sheila came and sat beside her. The old woman held out her hand. In her palm was a simple, thin strip of braided leather. She took Willa's wrist and tied it, the knot firm but not tight. She spoke softly, and this time Willa did not need a translation. The meaning was in her eyes, in the gentle pressure of her fingers. But Kai, who had walked up behind them, provided the words anyway. She says fear is a rope. You can let it bind you, or you can use it to pull yourself up. Do not let it become your master. The simple leather on her wrist felt like a piece of armor. Kai's own community was struggling with the same choice. An elder, a man with a face like dried leather and eyes that had seen too many treaties broken, had confronted him. "You bring a Bilagana woman into our camp," he had said, his voice heavy with concern. "You take up her fight. We have seen this story before. Kai Benali, the army follows. Trouble follows. Our duty is to our people, to keep them safe. Will helping this outsider bring a bigger storm down on us all?" "I understand your fear," Kai had answered, his voice respectful but unwavering. "But the storm is already here. McGraw is the storm. Her fight is now our fight. The papers she carries are a weapon we did not have before. To do nothing is to let the flood wash us away." The decision had to be made. That night, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to close the distance between earth and heaven, Willa and Kai stood looking out over the vast, sleeping desert. The posse was still out there, a scattered network of hunters. McGraw's men were in the valley, ready to tear the heart out of the land. "I will not run," Willa said, her voice clear and steady for the first time since the attack. "I made a promise." Kai nodded slowly. He had known this was her choice, just as he had known his own. "The territorial governor is in McGraw's pocket. Taking the evidence to him is useless," he said, "but the county seat is 2 days' ride north. The circuit judge there, Judge Morrison, is said to be a hard man, but an honest one. He does not like the railroad, and he does not like the army telling him how to run his court. It is our only chance." "It is a long way," Willa stated. "The reality of it settling in, they will be looking for us on every road." "We will not take the roads," Kai replied, a faint, rare smile touching his lips. "We will take the land's roads." He looked at her then, a real look, one that saw past the frightened woman from the east and acknowledged the determined person standing before him. In his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own resolve. They were two people from different worlds, bound together by a common enemy and a shared piece of ground. The fragile thread of trust that had begun in a violent ambush had been braided, strengthened by shared water, a shared fire, and a shared purpose. "To the county seat, then," she said. It was not a question, but a vow made to the silent, watchful desert. The county seat was not a town. It was a scar on the landscape, a collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, unforgiving emptiness. Dust, fine as red flour, coated everything, muffling the sound of their approach. They came in the gray hour before dawn, slipping through the quiet back alleys like shadows. Kai moved with a familiar stealth, but Willa felt as though 1,000 unseen eyes were watching her from the dark windows of the saloon, the sheriff's office, and the raw, unfinished depot of the coming railroad. Ada Morales' general store was a fortress of quiet defiance in the center of the town. The woman herself was built along the same lines, sturdy and unyielding, with eyes that saw more than they let on. She took one look at Willa's exhausted face and Kai's watchful stance and ushered them inside without a word, bolting the door behind them. "The posse came through an hour ago," Ada said in a low voice, stacking tins of peaches into a neat pyramid. Lieutenant Rourke was asking questions. Sheriff Choate was with them, looking about as comfortable as a man sitting on a cactus. "Silas McGraw's money has made our sheriff a very patient man." "Where can she stay?" Kai asked, his gaze sweeping the store, noting every entrance and exit. Ada led them to the back, through a beaded curtain that smelled of cinnamon and dust. The storeroom was narrow and deep, stacked to the ceiling with 100-pound sacks of flour, sugar, and beans. The air was thick and heavy, but it was safe. "There is a cot behind the flour sacks. It is not much, but no one will find you here." Willa's gratitude was a lump in her throat. "Thank you." Ada just gave a curt nod. The truth needs a safe place to hide sometimes. "You get some rest. Kai, you best make yourself scarce before the sun is fully up." Kai looked at Willa, a silent question in his eyes. She understood. He would not go far. As he slipped out the back door, he nearly collided with Jed Crow, the old cattleman from the stagecoach, who was examining a display of newfangled canned tomatoes. Jed's pale eyes flickered over Kai for a bare second before he turned his attention back to the can in his hand, his wrinkled face a mask of complete indifference. He had seen nothing. It was the quiet, stubborn code of men who had outlived the foolishness of taking sides in other people's wars, unless the side was clearly wrong. In that moment of deliberate blindness, a bond of unspoken alliance was forged. Later that morning, Ada brought Willa a tin plate of beans and a fresh shirt. With it, she brought a piece of paper that had been nailed to the sheriff's notice board. It was a wanted poster. The sketch was a crude, unflattering likeness, but the name was clear: Willa Hart, wanted for robbery and conspiracy. A generous reward was offered. Seeing her own face, her own name, branded as a criminal made her feel faint. Her reputation, her very identity, was being sold for a handful of dollars. As she stared at it, a fine, gritty rain began to fall, the drops mixing with the dust on the paper, making the ink run like tears down her captured face. From the storeroom's single grimy window, Willa could see the county courthouse across the street, and she could see the men Lieutenant Rourke had posted there. Two sat on the bench outside, pretending to whittle, but their eyes never stopped moving. Another leaned against the telegraph pole, his rifle held loosely but ready. It was not a watch. It was an ambush. "They know we are here," she whispered to Ada. "They are waiting for me to walk into their trap." "Then you will not walk into it," Ada said, her jaw set. "Not the way they expect. Anyway." Willa spent the day going over the documents, her mind racing. She could not wait for the judge to arrive. The papers were too vulnerable. They had to be entered into the court's protection. She changed into the plain shirt and a dusty skirt Ada provided, tucking her hair up under a simple bonnet. She looked like any other rancher's wife come to town for supplies. Just before the courthouse closed, she slipped out of the store and walked across the street, her heart pounding with every step. She did not look at Rourke's men. Keeping her head down, her satchel held tight, she walked past them and into the building. The clerk's office was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke. A balding man with ink-stained fingers looked up from his ledger, his expression one of profound boredom. "Office is closing," he said, not bothering to make eye contact. "I need to file these documents with the court," Willa said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "They are evidence for Judge Morrison." The clerk finally looked at her, his eyes dismissive. "The judge is not due for 2 days. Leave them here. I will see he gets them." "No," she said, her tone hardening. "I need them witnessed and sealed. Now." According to Territorial Statute 4, Section 7, any evidence pertaining to a case of contested land and water rights can be sealed by the clerk of the court to prevent tampering. The clerk blinked, surprised by her sudden command of legal detail. He peered at her more closely. "I do not know you." "My name is not important," Willa countered, pushing the satchel forward. "The documents are. They contain proof of criminal fraud that affects this entire county. If you refuse to seal them, you will be an accessory to that fraud. I am sure Judge Morrison will be very interested to hear about that." Her bluff, born of desperation and the hours spent studying Arthur's notes, hit its mark. The clerk, whose primary interest was avoiding any and all trouble, grumbled but pulled out a ledger, a stick of sealing wax, and the court's official stamp. He meticulously recorded each document, his initial boredom replaced by a grudging respect. As the final seal was pressed into the warm red wax, Willa felt a small, sharp victory. The papers were safe from theft, at least for now. Her victory was short-lived. As she hid in the storeroom that evening, the whispers started. Ada heard them at the counter. A ranch hand talking to a salesman. The woman from the stagecoach robbery, the one on the poster, was seen traveling with a Navajo scout. They say she is his woman now. The rumor spread through the saloon and the boarding house like a prairie fire, ugly and fast. Willa Hart, the school teacher, the respectable widow, was now a fugitive living with an Indian. In the closed, fearful world of the frontier town, it was a social death sentence. The knowledge isolated her, made the dusty air of the storeroom feel even more suffocating. And then, a new visitor arrived. Ada came to the curtain, her face pale. "There is a man here to see you. He says his name is Ethan Pike." Willa's blood ran cold. Ethan Pike. He had been a Pinkerton agent hired by the railroad, sent to her town back east a year before Arthur's death. He had been charming, handsome, and persistent. He had courted her briefly, before she had made it clear her heart was with her ailing husband. She stepped out into the store. Ethan stood by the counter, looking completely out of place in his tailored city suit. He was just as she remembered, confident and smiling, but his eyes were colder now. "Willa," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "It has been a long time. I am sorry we have to meet again under such difficult circumstances." "What do you want, Ethan?" He smiled, a practiced gesture that did not reach his eyes. "I have been retained by Silas McGraw. He is a reasonable man. He understands there has been a misunderstanding. He is prepared to be very generous to see this all put to rest. He will clear your name, drop all the charges, and provide you with a stipend that will allow you to live very comfortably, anywhere you choose. All I have to do is give you the documents and disappear," she finished for him. "Precisely. It is a simple business transaction. Willa, far better than being hunted in this wasteland. Far better than the company you are now forced to keep." His condescending glance toward the back of the store, where he assumed Kai was, filled her with a sudden, hot anger. "This is not a business transaction," she said, her voice low and fierce. "This is about a man's honor and a whole territory's future. You can tell Silas McGraw his offer is rejected. Now get out of this store." Ethan's smile finally vanished. "A pity," he said softly. "McGraw does not like to be disappointed. You are making a terrible mistake." He left as quietly as he had come, but his presence lingered like a poison. The threat was no longer just from rough men with guns like Rourke. It was from intelligent, ruthless men like Ethan, who fought with money and influence. That night, sleep would not come. Willa lay on the cot, the smell of flour thick in her nostrils, the leather of Sheila's bracelet a comforting presence on her wrist. The weight of it all, the wanted poster, the rumors, Ethan's veiled threat, pressed down on her. She must have dozed, because she was woken by a scream. It was Ada. Smoke was pouring from under the storeroom door. Willa's first thought was not of herself, but of the satchel. The papers, the originals were at the courthouse, sealed, but her copies, her notes, Arthur's journal, were all in the satchel beside her cot. The smoke was thick, blinding. Flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls where someone had thrown a lantern against the building. The heat was intense. She grabbed the satchel, coughing, her eyes streaming, and stumbled toward the back door. But a wall of fire blocked her path. She was trapped. Suddenly, the front storeroom door burst open. It was Kai. He had seen the flames from the livery stable where he had been hiding. Without hesitation, he plunged into the smoke-filled room, a wet cloth tied over his face. He found her, disoriented and choking, and grabbed her arm. "This way!" he yelled over the roar of the fire. He pulled her toward the main part of the store, shielding her with his own body as a flaming beam crashed down from the ceiling, showering them with sparks. They burst out into the night air, gasping for breath, just as the storeroom roof collapsed in a shower of embers. Willa was safe, the precious satchel clutched to her chest. She looked at Kai. His face was smudged with soot, and he was clutching his left arm. The sleeve of his shirt was scorched away, and a raw, angry burn stretched from his wrist to his elbow. He had thrust his own arm into the flames to shield her from the falling beam. He had saved her. He had saved the papers. But looking at the painful wound, Willa understood something deeper. He had not done it for a promise to a dead man or for a fight over water. He had done it for her, in the flickering, destructive light of the fire set by their enemies. She saw with perfect clarity the depth of the trust he had placed in her, a trust now sealed by sacrifice and flame. The fire had consumed the night, and now, in the gray, watery light of dawn, the town gathered to stare at the smoking skeleton of Ada's storeroom. The smell of wet ash and charred pine hung in the air, a bitter perfume of hatred. Inside the main store, which had been saved by a hastily formed bucket brigade, Willa knelt on the floor, her hands gentle and steady. She dipped a clean cloth into a bowl of boiled water Ada had prepared and began to clean the angry red burn on Kai's arm. The skin was blistered and raw. He sat perfectly still on a crate of tinned goods, his face a stoic mask, but she could see the tightening around his eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He had not made a sound since they had escaped the inferno, not a single complaint. "This will hurt," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He just looked at her, his dark eyes holding an expression she could not quite read. It was not just pain, it was something deeper, a silent acknowledgement that went beyond the chaos of their situation. Her touch was hesitant at first, clinical, like a teacher tending to a student's scraped knee. But as she worked, cleaning away the soot and applying the soothing salve of aloe and herbs Ada had given her, something shifted. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the unburned skin of his forearm. It was strong, warm, and alive. In the quiet of the morning, surrounded by the murmur of the townspeople outside and the lingering threat of their enemies, this small act of care became an island of peace. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the careful movements of her hands and the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time, she was not just an outsider he was protecting, and he was not just a guide leading her through a hostile land. They were simply a man and a woman, bound by a shared danger and a shared, unspoken vulnerability. He had shielded her from the fire. Now, she would shield him from the pain. Jed Crow broke the spell. He stomped into the store, his boots leaving dusty prints on the floorboards, his face grimmer than the morning sky. "They did a thorough job," he said, gesturing with his thumb toward the wreckage. "But a fire is a clumsy weapon. A man like McGraw, he prefers a pen or a surveyor's chain. I'm going for a ride. Check some fences." No one questioned him. They all knew he was not going to check fences. While he was gone, Ethan Pike found her. He did not come into the store this time. A young boy, paid a nickel for his errand, delivered a folded note. It said only, "The old well, 10 minutes. Alone. Willa found him waiting by the crumbling stone ring of the town's first, now abandoned, well. He looked haggard, his fine suit rumpled, the confidence gone from his eyes. "You have to listen to me. Willa," he said, his voice low and urgent. "This is not a game anymore. The fire was just a message. McGraw is done with warnings. He's bringing in a new crew of men from the railhead. Hard men. His plan is to force the Navajo off the land near the spring. He will provoke a fight, a small one, just enough to give Lieutenant Rourke a reason to move in with his soldiers. Rourke will call it an uprising. McGraw will call it clearing his lawfully purchased property, and the territorial government will call it progress." His eyes pleaded with her. "Let me help you. Give me the documents. I will tell them I overpowered you and recovered them. You will be a victim, not a conspirator. I can have you on a train, heading east, with enough money to start a new life, before this valley is soaked in blood." "Why?" Willa asked, searching his face for the truth. "Why would you do this? Are you afraid of him?" Ethan looked away, toward the vast, empty plains. "I have done things. Willa, for men like him, I told myself it was just a job, but I have seen what happens when the talking stops. I am not a monster, and I knew your husband. He was a decent man. This is not the way his story should end." His motives remained a murky pool of self-interest and what might have been a flicker of conscience. But his warning felt real. She could hear the truth in his fear. "I cannot—" "Ethan?" she said, her voice firm, the leather tie on her wrist a solid reminder of her promise. "This story does not end with me running away." "Then God help you," he whispered, "because no one else will." By midday, Jed returned, his horse lathered, his face set in hard lines. He did not speak at first, just took a long drink from the water barrel. Then he looked at Kai and Willa. "I found them," he said. "Survey stakes, new ones, not by the springs. They are a good 200 yards south, in the middle of a dry wash. Each one is marked with the territorial seal. It is a lie, set in stone and wood. He has created a false history for the stream. According to his new map, Coyote Springs is just a seasonal overflow. The original stream, the one with all the legal rights, is on land he already controls." The sheer audacity of the plan was breathtaking. McGraw was not just stealing the water. He was erasing it from the map, moving it with a surveyor's chain and a bribed official's stamp. The fire had made the town a trap. They could not stay. That night, Jed led them to the livery, where 2 saddled horses stood waiting in the darkness. "Ride north," he said, handing Kai a worn rifle from its scabbard. "Stay off the main trails. These animals know the country better than you do." They rode out, 2 small figures swallowed by the immense darkness of the plains. The rain had cleared, and a sliver of moon cast a pale, ghostly light over the land. They had been riding for an hour when Kai suddenly reined in his horse, his head cocked, listening. Willa heard it a moment later, the faint, rhythmic drumming of hoofbeats, coming fast. They spurred their horses, racing across the open grassland. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Willa risked a glance over her shoulder. 6 riders, dark shapes against the horizon, closing the distance. A flash of orange, and the sharp crack of a rifle split the night. A bullet whined past Willa's ear, terrifyingly close. Kai swerved, leading them toward a chaotic jumble of rocks and gullies. They plunged into the maze of shadows, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the stone. The pursuit was relentless. One of the riders had a bright lantern tied to his saddle, its swaying yellow light cutting through the darkness, illuminating their path for the others. It was a beacon, guiding their enemies. "We cannot outrun that light," Kai yelled over the thunder of their ride. He pulled his horse to a skidding halt behind a tall spire of rock. "Hold my reins. Keep his head steady." He swung down from the saddle, pulling the rifle Jed had given him. He rested the barrel on a rock ledge, taking aim into the darkness. Willa watched, her heart in her throat. The lantern was a small, dancing target 100 yards away. The man carrying it was riding hard. Kai's breath was a steady, focused thing. He exhaled slowly, and the rifle roared, its flash a momentary star in the darkness. For a second, nothing happened. Then, the small yellow light across the plains exploded in a shower of glass and flame. The world was plunged into absolute blackness. Confused shouts echoed from the pursuers. They had lost their eyes. In that moment of chaos, Kai was back in the saddle, grabbing his reins from Willa. He urged the horses forward, not away, but deeper into the warren of rocks, his knowledge of the land their only guide. They rode for another hour, twisting and turning through the unseen landscape until the sounds of the pursuit faded into silence. They finally stopped in a sheltered cove, the horses blowing and trembling. The adrenaline slowly drained away, leaving a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. Kai stood beside his horse, staring out into the darkness that had saved them. He was a warrior, a protector. He had fought and outsmarted their enemies. But Willa saw the cost in the rigid set of his shoulders. He had used a rifle, a white man's weapon, to fight a white man's war. He stood between two worlds, fighting for the survival of one, using the tools of the other. The balance Sheila had spoken of was a difficult, dangerous path to walk. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they made their way to a high ridge overlooking the valley. They needed to see what they were fighting for. They dismounted and stood side by side, looking down at the land waking below. And then they saw it. In the clear, unforgiving light of the new day, a line of fresh pine stakes marched across the land. They were not subtle. They were a declaration of war. They began at the mouth of Coyote Springs and ran straight through the heart of the Navajo grazing lands. Nailed to each stake was a bright, newly painted sign. Even from this distance, they could read the bold, black letters that spelled out their new reality. Emmix, Gra property. No trespassing. The line of stakes was an obscenity against the land, a raw scar of possession. The signs, stark and white, were a declaration that a piece of paper in a faraway office was now more powerful than the generations of people who had lived and died on this soil. A cold, hard anger settled in Willa's heart, displacing the fear. It was the same anger she had felt as a child, watching the river behind her home shrink to a muddy trickle, its life choked off by the insatiable thirst of a new factory upstream. The memory, long dormant, rose with a surprising clarity. The dead fish, the cracked earth where water had once flowed, the bewildered silence of the birds. It was all happening again, on a scale she could scarcely imagine. They did not have time to linger on the ridge. A glint of sunlight off a spyglass from the valley below told them they had been seen. The hunt was on again. They rode hard, pushing the horses, following the jagged contours of the land. The terrain became more broken, a labyrinth of canyons and washes. The sky, which had been a clear, brilliant blue, began to curdle. Dark, bruised-looking clouds gathered on the horizon, moving in with an unnatural speed. The air grew heavy and still, charged with a strange, electric tension. The first drops of rain were fat and cold, striking the dry earth with a hiss. Within minutes, the drizzle became a downpour, a solid sheet of water that blurred the world into a gray chaos. The dry washes began to run with brown, churning water. What had been a refuge was quickly becoming a trap. Through the deluge, Kai spotted it. A dark opening in the face of a sheer cliff, a shallow cave carved by wind and water over 1,000 years. He led them toward it, the horses stumbling on the now slick rock. They scrambled inside just as a deafening clap of thunder shook the very foundations of the mountain. The cave was not deep, more of a wide, sheltered ledge, but it was dry. They unsaddled the shivering horses and led them to the back of the space, where they stood, heads drooping, grateful for the respite. A small pile of dry wood left by some previous traveler was tucked into a crevice. Kai, his movements economical and sure. Soon had a small, crackling fire going. Its light pushed back the gloom and cast dancing shadows on the cave walls. As the warmth spread, Willa saw that the walls were not smooth. They were covered in faint, elegant carvings, spirals, stick-like figures with feathered heads, the distinct shape of a horned toad, the art of a people long gone, yet still present. "My ancestors camped here," Kai said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to be part of the storm's percussion. "They would come here to hunt, to pray, to find their balance again." He traced one of the spirals with his finger. When a warrior went into a bad place, when he saw things that unsettled his spirit, the singers would perform a ceremony for him. The Hozhuji, the blessing way. It is a ceremony to walk him out of the darkness and back into the beauty, to make him whole again. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "This journey we are on, it is a bad place. We must be careful not to lose our way." The rain fell in a steady, drumming rhythm, a curtain of gray isolating them from the world. The intimacy of the small, fire-lit space was palpable. Willa found herself speaking of the river, of her childhood, a story she had not told anyone in years. "There was a place I loved," she said, her gaze lost in the flames. A bend in the river shaded by willow trees. "I used to sit there for hours, reading, watching the kingfishers dive. The water was so clear you could count the stones on the bottom. Then the mill came. They built a dam. They said it was progress, more jobs, a better future." She paused, the old sadness a fresh ache in her chest. The river died. It did not happen all at once. It was a slow strangulation. The water level dropped. The current slowed. A green scum grew on the surface. The willows turned yellow and lost their leaves. One day I went back and the kingfishers were gone. That is when I knew. You can kill a place without ever firing a shot. Kai listened, his silence a form of understanding more profound than any words could have been. He saw the line that connected a small girl's grief in a green eastern valley to a determined woman's fight in this vast, red desert. The weapon was different, a dam instead of a fraudulent document, but the crime was the same. It was the crime of taking what did not belong to you, of breaking the sacred balance for the sake of greed. The firelight flickered on his injured arm, and she saw that the rough ride had soiled the bandage. She reached for the small medicine pouch Ada had given her. "Let me look at that," she said softly. She knelt before him in the cramped space, their knees almost touching. She gently unwrapped the cloth. The burn was still raw, but it was clean. She took a fresh strip of linen and the salve. As she worked, her focus narrowed to her task, her touch gentle and sure. The storm raged outside, a wild and violent symphony. But inside the cave, there was only the crackle of the fire and the sound of their quiet breathing. The air between them grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the lightning outside. She was intensely aware of his closeness, the warmth radiating from his body, the steady beat of his pulse beneath her fingers as she secured the new bandage. She looked up, and his eyes were on her, dark and searching. The stoic mask was gone. In its place was a raw vulnerability that mirrored her own. "I have never been this close to a man," she said, the words a confession, whispered into the small space that separated them. His gaze held hers, steady and deep. He leaned forward just a fraction, the firelight catching the strong lines of his face. "You already are," he whispered. The truth of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. They had been this close for days. They had been bound by shared fear, by a desperate flight, by a promise whispered in firelight. Their spirits had touched long before their bodies. This moment was not a beginning, but a recognition of what already was. He did not kiss her. He simply raised his uninjured hand and gently touched her fingers where they rested on his arm. The touch was electric, a current of warmth and tenderness that flowed through her. chasing away the last of the fear and the loneliness. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a comfort, all in one silent gesture. She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his. The world outside, with its fire and its guns and its lies, fell away. There was only the shelter of the cave, the warmth of the fire, and the solid, undeniable truth of his hand in hers. They stayed that way for a long time as the fire burned low and the storm slowly wept itself into silence. The light that filtered into the cave the next morning was clean and sharp. The world washed new by the rain. The fire was a pile of gray ashes. They sat apart, the spell of the night broken but not forgotten. A new line had been drawn. A new understanding reached. Willa spoke first, her voice quiet but clear. "What happened last night? It was real, but it cannot change what we have to do." Kai nodded, his expression serious. "Coyote Springs comes first. My people, your promise. That is the path we are on. Nothing can change that." It was not a denial of what had passed between them, but a reaffirmation of their purpose. They were allies, partners in a desperate fight. Their feelings for each other could not become a weakness. They had to be a source of strength, another weapon in their arsenal. Love was not about possession or distraction. It was about protection, protecting each other, and protecting the land that gave them both life. They had found their balance, their own Hozo, in the heart of the storm. They were preparing to leave, the air fresh and cool, when a sound drifted into the cave, an echo against the wet rock. It was a sound that made Willa's blood run cold, the jingle of a bridle, the clink of a horseshoe on stone. Then, a man's voice, rough and impatient, carried on the clear morning air. "Spread out, the tracks lead this way. They cannot have gone far." Willa and Kai looked at each other, the same grim understanding in their eyes. The entrance to the cave, their only way out, was a frame of bright, unforgiving daylight, and silhouetted against it, they could now see the shapes of men on horseback, blocking their escape. Rourke's posse had found them. They were trapped. The world outside the cave entrance was a frame of armed men. There was no escape. Lieutenant Rourke sat on his horse, a smug, satisfied expression on his face, the rain having washed none of the cruelty from it. "You have led us on quite a chase," he said, his voice echoing in the small cave. "But the game is over." They were forced out into the clean morning light, their hands bound. Rourke's men were rough, their satisfaction evident in the tightness of the ropes and the shoves they used to hurry them along. They were not taken back to the town, but led directly down into the valley, toward Coyote Springs, toward the heart of the conflict. The scene at the spring was one of organized chaos. McGraw's new men, a hard-bitten collection of railroad muscle and hired guns, were systematically dismantling the small, temporary camps of the Navajo families who had gathered to protect their water source. They kicked over cooking pots, tore down shelters, and threw personal belongings onto a growing bonfire. It was not just an eviction. It was a calculated act of humiliation. Rourke forced Willa and Kai to the edge of the clearing, a public display of his victory. "Here are your champions," he shouted to the distraught Navajo people. "Caught like rats in a trap. This land belongs to Mr. McGraw now. This water belongs to the railroad. Progress has arrived. You will move, or you will be moved." He turned his attention to Kai, a sneer twisting his lips. "I remember you, Benali. You were a good scout. You knew how to follow orders. You knew your place. What happened to that man?" "That man learned that some orders should never be followed," Kai answered, his voice low and steady, carrying across the tense silence. "He learned that a man's place is with his people, on his own land." Rourke laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Your land. This is United States territory. Your people are tenants. And the rent is due." He turned to one of his sergeants. "Burn the rest. I want them gone by noon." The soldiers and McGraw's men moved forward with torches. The Navajo people, mostly women, children, and old men, stood their ground. A silent, unmoving wall of defiance. They had no weapons, only the strength of their conviction. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, a wild yell and the rumbling of wagon wheels. From the direction of the town, Jed Crow appeared, whipping a team of horses into a frenzy. The wagon he drove was old and Rick S.W., piled high with hay and loose timber. It careened toward the clearing, a runaway engine of chaos. Jed guided it directly toward the largest bonfire and, with a final shout, leaped clear, rolling into a ditch as the wagon crashed into the flames. The dry hay and wood erupted in a massive fireball, sending a thick, billowing cloud of black smoke across the entire clearing. It was a perfect diversion. In the confusion, Jed was already on his feet, waving frantically to the women and children. Through the smoke, he yelled, "This way! To the rocks!" Under the cover of the smoke, the human wall broke, and the most vulnerable began to scramble for safety. At the same time, another figure stepped forward, Ada Morales, her face set like stone, walked directly into the path of two of McGraw's men who were carrying a crate of dynamite toward the spring's source. She stood before them, unarmed, her hands on her hips. "You will not," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You will not do this, not today." The men, taken aback by this stout, unmovable woman, hesitated. They were paid to fight, not to manhandle a town storekeeper. Before they could decide, Willa made her move. She had been working at the ropes on her wrists, fraying them against a sharp rock she had been pushed against. With a final, painful twist, her hands were free. She ran to her horse, where the satchel with her copies of the documents was still tied. She pulled out the main map, the one with the forged seal, and walked to the center of the clearing, her voice ringing out with the authority of a schoolteacher commanding a classroom. "Stop! You have no right to do this. This land is not yours." Rourke turned, his face purple with rage. "Caesar!" But the men were all looking at her, at the official-looking document in her hand. The smoke was beginning to clear. The crowd was no longer just soldiers and Navajo. Townspeople, drawn by the fire, had gathered at the edges, watching. "This is a legal survey map," Willa declared. Holding it high for all to see, it shows the true boundaries of this watershed, and it bears the seal of the Coyote Springs Territorial Office. It is a legally binding document. Any action you take here is a criminal act. One of McGraw's foremen, a big man with a sweat-stained hat, spat on the ground. "That is just a piece of paper. We have our orders." He nodded to a miner who held a lit fuse, ready to touch it to a stick of dynamite. "Look at the seal," Willa commanded, her voice cutting through the tension. "Read the date beside it." She read it aloud, her voice clear and unwavering. Then she pointed a finger at the foreman. "Now you look at these people. You are miners, ranchers. You live by the grace of the land and the law. This man, Silas McGraw, is breaking that law. He is using a dead man's signature to steal the water not just from the Navajo, but from every last one of you." The miner with the fuse hesitated. He was a simple man, paid a day's wage for a day's work. He looked from the paper in Willa's hand to the frightened faces of the children huddled in the rocks. He looked at the pure, clear water bubbling up from the earth at his feet. This was not what he had signed up for. With a curse, he threw the sputtering fuse into the mud, where it extinguished with a soft hiss. That single act of defiance broke the spell. The tide had turned. Rourke, seeing his authority crumble, lost control. He drew his pistol. "It is my authority that matters here." He fired a shot into the air. "Do as I say." In the ensuing panic, one of the bonfires, weakened by the wagon crash, collapsed, sending a shower of burning logs rolling toward the rocks where the children were hiding. A young boy, no more than 7, scrambled away but tripped, falling directly in the path of a heavy, smoldering stake. "Kai," who had also freed himself from his bonds in the confusion, moved without thinking. He lunged forward, grabbing the boy and throwing him back toward his mother, but he was not quite fast enough. As he pushed off the ground, a bullet, fired by one of Rourke's panicked soldiers, tore through the flesh of his shoulder. He stumbled back, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Willa screamed his name. She ran to him as he staggered, pushing him down behind the cover of an overturned wagon. The battle was devolving into a chaotic skirmish, but her world had narrowed to the man bleeding in front of her. She ripped a long strip from her petticoat, her hands shaking but her purpose clear. She pressed the cloth hard against the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. His face was pale, but his eyes were on her, a fierce, protective light still burning in them. She leaned over him, shielding his body with her own, a silent vow to protect him as he had protected her. The standoff dissolved into a tense stalemate, a confused mess of shouting men and crying children. And into this tableau of broken authority, a new figure walked calmly into the clearing. It was Ethan Pike. He was dressed impeccably as always, but he carried himself differently. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He walked to a makeshift table that McGraw's men had been using and placed his own pistol upon it with a solid, definitive thud. All eyes turned to him. "Lieutenant Rourke," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced ease. "I believe your services are no longer required." "What is the meaning of this?" Pike Rourke blustered, though his face had gone pale. "The meaning," Ethan replied, reaching into the inside pocket of his coat, "is that your contract with Silas McGraw has been terminated." He pulled out a folded piece of paper and held it up. "I have here the signed agreement between you and Mr. McGraw, the one that details the payment you are to receive for clearing this land of its current inhabitants, by any means necessary. I believe the term the judge will use for it is conspiracy. You traded lives for water. Lieutenant, it is a poor bargain." Ethan Pike's accusation, backed by the damning piece of paper in his hand, hung in the dusty air like the silence after a gunshot. Lieutenant Rourke, stripped of his authority and his bluster, stood exposed, his face the color of spoiled milk. For a long moment, no one moved. The tense tableau at Coyote Springs was broken by the one man who should have acted hours before Sheriff Tom Choate, spurred into action by the undeniable proof of conspiracy and the dozens of witnesses now surrounding him. He drew his pistol, though it looked unnatural and heavy in his hand. "Lieutenant Rourke," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "you and your men are under my jurisdiction now. You will lay down your arms." The confrontation was over. The fight for the water, however, had just moved to a new battlefield. Judge Morrison arrived 2 days later, not in a fine carriage, but on a dust-covered horse, looking more like a weary circuit preacher than a territorial judge. He was a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that seemed to weigh and measure everything they saw. He wasted no time on ceremony. The hearing would be held in the open, in the dusty street between Ada's store and the courthouse, where everyone could see and hear. It was a trial by sunlight. Silas McGraw had arrived as well, not with a gang of hired guns, but with a lawyer from Chicago. The lawyer was a man named Fletcher, dressed in a black wool suit that defied the oppressive heat. He was slick and polished, and his voice was smooth as oiled leather. The town gathered, a nervous, sweating crowd divided by invisible lines of allegiance and fear. On one side stood the ranchers and townsfolk who depended on McGraw's goodwill or his payroll. On the other stood a smaller, more resolute group, Ada Morales, Jed Crow, a handful of small ranchers whose own wells were running low, and the Navajo families, who stood together in a silent, dignified block, with Sheila at their center. Willa stood with Kai near the makeshift table that served as the judge's bench. Kai's arm was in a sling she had fashioned, the wound a dull, throbbing reminder of the battle they had already fought. He stood tall, His presence a quiet challenge to the murmurs and hostile stares directed their way. Fletcher began, his voice condescendingly reasonable. He did not dispute that the stakes had been placed. He argued that Silas McGraw, a great benefactor to this territory, had simply been acting on the information provided by the most recent territorial survey. If the stream's course had shifted over the years, a common and natural occurrence, as he put it, that was a matter for geologists, not for the court. He painted a picture of progress and prosperity, of a railroad that would bring civilization and commerce, all being held up by the sentimental claims of a few squatters and a hysterical woman from the east. When it was Willa's turn, she did not speak with passion, but with a cold, clear precision. She laid Arthur's maps on the table, the older official surveys beside McGraw's new fraudulent one. "These are not sentimental claims, Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying in the still air. "These are facts. Here is the official 1870 survey, and the 1880. Both show Coyote Springs exactly where it is today, and here is Mr. McGraw's map, the one based on the so-called unnatural diversion." She pointed to the surveyor's signature. "This map is dated last year. The surveyor who supposedly signed it died of cholera 2 years before that." A murmur went through the crowd. Jed Crow was next. He stood before the judge, his hat in his gnarled hands, and spoke in the simple, direct language of the plains. "I have ranched in this valley for 30 years. He said, "I know every rock and every trickle of water. That stream has not moved an inch, not in my lifetime, and those survey stakes Mr. Fletcher calls official. I found them myself. They were new pine, not weathered. They were set in a dry wash that has not seen a flood in 20 years. They are a lie, plain and simple." The most powerful testimony came from Sheila. She stood before the judge, a small, ancient woman wrapped in a colorful blanket, her face a mask of serene dignity. She did not look at the crowd or the lawyer. She spoke directly to the judge, in her own language, her voice a soft, melodic chant. Kai translated, his own voice filled with a quiet reverence. "She says this water is not a thing to be owned. It is a sacred place. Her grandmother's grandmother brought her here as a child to make offerings, to pray for balance. Our people have come here for longer than any map can remember, to wash away sickness and celebrate new life. She says the history of our people is written on this land, in the water." Sheila then unrolled a small, beautifully woven rug. The pattern was intricate, a series of interlocking blue and white lines against a red background. "This is the story of the spring," Kai explained. "The blue lines are the water that you can see. The white lines are the water under the ground, the lifeblood of the earth. My grandmother's mother wove this. It is a map of the soul of this place." She then held up a small, smooth, perfectly round stone with a hole in the center. "The stones of the spring are holy," Kai translated. "They are given to our children when they are born, to remind them where they come from. To steal this water is to steal the memory and the future of our people." Fletcher scoffed loudly. "Your Honor, this is folklore, not evidence. Rugs and pebbles have no standing in a court of law." But Judge Morrison was not looking at Fletcher. He was looking at the faces of the small ranchers in the crowd, men who understood the language of the land far better than the language of the courtroom. He saw them nodding slowly, their eyes on the old woman. They knew truth when they heard it, whether it was spoken in English or Navajo. The final piece was Ethan Pike. He took the stand looking pale and diminished. He confessed everything. He told of how McGraw had hired him to intimidate Willa, to retrieve the papers, to orchestrate the false robbery. He described the plan to burn them out, and he produced the written order, signed by Rourke but clearly drafted on McGraw letterhead, authorizing the violent removal of the Navajo. "I am guilty of conspiracy and intimidation, Your Honor," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "But I did not want to be an accessory to something far worse. I asked the court for mercy." The case was made. The truth, multifaceted and undeniable, lay bare in the dust of the street. Fletcher sat down, his smug confidence gone, replaced by the grim realization that his clever words had been no match for the simple power of honest testimony. Judge Morrison looked out over the silent, expectant crowd. He looked at Silas McGraw, whose face was an unreadable mask of cold fury. He looked at Willa and Kai, standing together, their fight nearly won. "The laws of this territory," the judge began, his voice slow and deliberate, "were written to protect the property and the rights of all its citizens. They were not written to be the tools of powerful men to dispossess the weak. The evidence of fraud is overwhelming. The evidence of a violent conspiracy is undeniable." A wave of relief washed over Willa. It was over. They had won. But before the judge could deliver his final verdict, a new sound split the air. It was a sound that did not belong in the quiet valley. A high, piercing shriek, alien and imperious. A train whistle. Everyone turned. On the far side of the valley, where the new rail line was being laid, a work train had appeared, pulling flat cars loaded with rails and ties. It chuffed toward them, a black, smoke-belching monster of iron and steam. It did not slow as it approached the hearing. It showed no sign of stopping at all. At its head, standing on the cowcatcher like a conquering general, was Silas McGraw's foreman, and behind him, a crew of 50 men began unloading rails, moving with a practiced, relentless efficiency. They were ignoring the judge, the sheriff, the law itself. They were going to lay their track right through the heart of Coyote Springs, and no piece of paper was going to stop them. The train whistle was a declaration of war. It sliced through the judge's words, rendering the law a feeble whisper against the roar of iron and steam. Silas McGraw's machine was moving, a physical manifestation of his contempt for everything that had just transpired. The hearing was over, dismissed not by a gavel but by a locomotive. For a moment, the people stood frozen, caught between the fragile authority of the law and the undeniable power of the railroad. Judge Morrison's face was a mask of cold fury, but he was one man. Sheriff Choate looked lost, his badge a useless piece of tin against this new reality. The foreman on the work train laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound that carried over the hiss of the engine. His men, a rough army of laborers, began to swarm from the flat cars, carrying hammers and steel rails. The day ended in a tense, simmering stalemate. The judge retired to his room. The law held in abeyance. McGraw's men set up a work camp, their lanterns creating a hostile island of light in the growing twilight. They would start laying track at first light. That night, the sky broke. A cold, steady rain began to fall, turning the dusty street to mud and washing the world in shades of gray. In the back of Ada's store, the small group of allies gathered. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and brewing coffee. There was no talk of surrender. Jed Crow, whittling a piece of wood with sharp, angry strokes, spoke first. "That temporary track they are laying to cross the creek bed, it is all haste and brute force. It is held together with heavy wooden shims and wedges, hammered in place. Not built to last, just built to get the train across." Kai looked at him, understanding dawning in his eyes. If those wedges were removed, the track would not collapse. Jed continued, but it would sag, shift. It would be useless, unsafe for an engine to cross. It would stop them, and it would not harm a soul. It was a plan born of the land itself, quiet, stubborn, and unyielding. They would not meet force with force, but with knowledge and resolve. They would not fight like their enemy. They would simply make it impossible for him to proceed. They moved after midnight, a small band of ghosts in the driving rain. Kai, Willa, Jed, and Ada led the way. Behind them came a dozen others, the young Navajo men whose families were at stake, and 3 of the small ranchers, their face grimly determined. Sheila did not go, but as they left, she pressed a small, smooth stone from the spring into Willa's hand. It was cold and solid, a piece of the earth they were fighting for. The work was brutal and silent. McGraw's men were in their tents, seeking shelter from the storm, with only a few guards posted. Their collars turned up against the rain. The hiss of the steam from the idling engine and the drumming of the downpour on canvas and metal covered the sounds of their work. They used pry bars and muffled hammers, their movements economical and urgent. The wood was slick with rain, the mud deep and cloying. Willa worked alongside the men, her hands raw, her muscles screaming in protest. She felt Kai's presence beside her in the darkness, a steady, reassuring strength. They were a single unit, a community bound by the shared purpose of defiance. They had loosened the last of the main wedges when a lantern beam cut through the darkness. A shout went up. They had been discovered. Lieutenant Rourke appeared out of the rainy darkness, his face a contorted mask of pure rage. He was no longer a soldier or a lawman. He was a cornered animal. Behind him, a handful of McGraw's men scrambled from their tents, grabbing rifles. "I will see you all hang for this," Rourke screamed, his voice cracking. He lunged forward and drew his pistol, aiming it directly at Kai. But before he could fire, a large hand shot out and clamped down on his wrist, forcing the gun's barrel toward the sky. It was the miner, the one who had refused to light the dynamite. He had been among the ranchers who had joined them. "No more," he said, his voice a low growl that was more powerful than Rourke's shriek. "We are working men. Lieutenant, we are not hired for your crimes." Rourke struggled, his face inches from the miners, his madness now complete. The pistol fired, the shot a deafening crack in the night, the bullet tearing harmlessly through the canvas of a nearby tent. In the confusion, Silas McGraw, who had emerged from a private rail car, turned to flee. He scrambled away into the darkness, but his expensive city shoes found no purchase in the slick mud. He let out a yelp as his feet went out from under him, and he tumbled backward into the deep, water-filled ditch his own men had dug. There was a sharp crack and a scream of pain. At the same moment, Willa saw her chance. While all eyes were on the struggle with Rourke, she ran toward the locomotive. The engine cab was empty, fueled by adrenaline. She pulled herself up the slippery iron steps. She did not know how to drive the machine, but she knew what the whistle was for. She grabbed the cord and pulled with all her might. A deafening, continuous blast shattered the night, a scream of steam and steel that could be heard for miles. It was an alarm, a call to witness, a signal that the fight was not over. The work crew, hearing the emergency whistle, assumed a catastrophic failure and stopped in their tracks. The entire operation ground to a halt. Lights came on all over town. Men spilled out of the saloon. And at the head of the running, armed crowd was Sheriff Tom Choate. He took in the scene at a glance, the disarmed and struggling Rourke, the groaning McGraw being pulled from the ditch with his leg bent at an unnatural angle, the resolute band of saboteurs standing over the disabled track. The shame on his face was visible even in the dim lantern light. He had been shamed into action. He walked directly to Rourke, took the pistol from his hand, and clicked the handcuffs around his wrists. The rain began to soften as the first pale hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The world was washed clean, quiet now except for the pained moans of Silas McGraw. The battle was over. The community, a fragile alliance of ranchers, townspeople, and the Navajo, had stood together and won. Justice, which had seemed so distant and frail, had arrived on the back of their collective courage. Judge Morrison stood in the morning light, his expression grimly satisfied. He signed the document with a flourish. "This order grants temporary protection to Coyote Springs and the surrounding lands," he declared. Handing the paper to Sheriff Choate, "All work on this rail line will cease until a full federal investigation is complete." It was a victory, real and absolute. Willa stood beside Kai, watching the sunrise paint the wet landscape in hues of rose and gold. They had done it, She felt his hand find hers in the crowd, his fingers lacing through hers. But as the judge turned to leave, he paused and looked at Willa, his expression softening with something like regret. He spoke quietly to the sheriff, who nodded and glanced uncomfortably in her direction. The wanted poster, though born of a lie, was still an official document. The charges of robbery and conspiracy, filed by Rourke, were still on the books. The shadow of the law, once a weapon used against her, had not yet fully passed. She was a hero, but in the eyes of the territorial government, she was still a fugitive. The silence that followed the storm was a strange and unfamiliar thing. For weeks, the valley had been a place of tension, of whispered threats and open conflict. Now, a profound quiet had settled over the land, broken only by the gentle murmur of the spring and the distant sound of a hammer repairing the damage to Ada's store. The air, washed clean by the rain, felt lighter, as if the whole territory had exhaled a breath it had been holding for too long. Silas McGraw, his legs splinted and his face a mask of impotent fury, was taken away in a buckboard under the sheriff's guard. His reign, built on paper and intimidation, had ended in a muddy ditch. Lieutenant Rourke, stripped of his uniform and his pride, was confined to the town's small jail, awaiting transfer to a federal marshal. The law, so long a tool for the powerful, was finally beginning to serve its true purpose. The town itself began the slow, awkward process of mending. The change was not loud or sudden. It happened in small, quiet moments. It was in the way the miner who had stopped Rourke now shared a cup of coffee with one of the young Navajo men at Ada's counter. It was in the way Jed Crow was seen showing Sheila a new type of sewing needle, the two of them communicating in a shared language of gestures and mutual respect. Ada Morales, in a revolutionary act of commerce and community, took down a new ledger. She opened it to a fresh page and drew a clean line down the middle. At the top of one column, she wrote town. At the top of the other, she wrote dine. Then, with a firm, deliberate motion, she drew a single, large circle that encompassed them both. The water was for everyone, and so was the credit at her store. Ethan Pike's sentencing was a quiet affair. He stood before Judge Morrison not as a slick agent of influence, but as a man stripped bare. In exchange for his full and truthful testimony against McGraw's entire operation, he was given a reduced sentence to be served not in a federal prison, but here, in the territory, working to help rebuild what his employer had sought to destroy. Before he was led away, he asked to speak with Willa one last time. They stood by the abandoned well where he had first tried to bargain with her. "I thought I loved you," he said, his voice quiet, his eyes on the distant mesas, but it was not love. It was a desire to own, like McGraw in the water. "I thought if I could possess your beauty, your goodness, it would somehow become my own. I see now that is not how it works. You cannot own what is good. You can only stand beside it and try to be better. I hope to learn how to do that." Willa looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not an enemy or a tempter, but simply a lost man trying to find his way back. "There is always time to learn, Ethan," she said. The words were a forgiveness and a release. Her own freedom came a week later. A rider arrived from the territorial capital with an official dispatch. Judge Morrison's report, combined with testimony from Sheriff Choate and a dozen citizens, had been received. The wanted poster was officially rescinded. All charges against her were dismissed with prejudice, meaning they could never be brought again. Her name was hers once more. The weight of the accusation, a burden she had carried for so long she had almost forgotten its feel, lifted from her shoulders. She was no longer a fugitive. She was just Willa Hart. That afternoon, she sat on a stool in the sunlight outside the store, a small sewing basket in her lap. Kai sat opposite her, his arm resting on his knee. The wound was healing cleanly, the angry red fading to a healthy pink. It was time for the stitches to come out. She worked with a practiced, gentle hand, the one she used to mend the torn pages of school books or stitch the delicate paper of Arthur's maps back together, with a pair of small, sharp scissors. She snipped each black thread before carefully pulling it free with a pair of tweezers. His skin was warm beneath her fingers. Every wound can be mended, she thought. A quiet revelation. A tear in a map. A burn on an arm. A division in a community. It all could be healed, if someone was willing to sit patiently and with care and do the stitching. She pulled the last thread free, and the work was done. A fine, pale scar remained, a permanent record of the fight, a mark of his sacrifice. She traced its path with the tip of her finger, a touch as light as a breath. He watched her, his expression soft. "When you first arrived, you carried a bag full of torn paper," he said. "Now you have stitched a wound. You have helped to stitch this valley back together." "It was not I alone," she answered, her gaze meeting his. "We all did, together." Later, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in colors of fire and peace, he led her away from the town, along the quiet path that followed the stream. They walked in comfortable silence, the only sound the gurgle of the water and the crunch of their feet on the sandy soil. He brought her to a small, sheltered meadow, a place where the spring water pooled in a clear, shallow basin before continuing its journey. The air was sweet with the scent of wild herbs and damp earth. Sheila was waiting for them. She did not speak, but smiled a welcome, her eyes full of a deep, ancient light. She had built a small, smokeless fire, and on a blanket she had laid out several items: a bowl of sacred corn pollen, a fan of eagle feathers, and a single, perfect ear of blue corn. She began a soft, rhythmic chant, her voice blending with the sound of the water. It was a song of gratitude, of thanksgiving to the land for its endurance, and to the water for its life. She took a pinch of corn pollen and offered it to the four directions, then to the sky above and the earth below. She gestured for Willa and Kai to do the same. Willa followed her lead, the fine yellow powder feeling like dust from the sun itself on her fingers. As she released it into the air, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her, a feeling of belonging that she had never known before. This land, once so alien and harsh, was now a part of her. When the ceremony was over, Sheila looked at Willa. She spoke, her voice gentle, and Kai translated. "My grandmother says you have a name among our people now. We will call you Hul Agu Adahaya." "What does it mean?" Willa whispered, the beautiful, unfamiliar sounds echoing in her heart. Kai smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his face. "It means she who keeps a promise." Tears welled in Willa's eyes. It was the most beautiful name she had ever heard. It was a name that honored not only her, but Arthur as well. His quest was finished. His truth had been given a voice. She stood with Kai by the water's edge as Sheila quietly gathered her things and departed, leaving them alone in the twilight. The first stars were beginning to appear in the deep purple sky. She still held the smooth, cool stone from the spring in her hand. "What will you do now?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. "Your name is clear. You can go anywhere you want, back east, if you choose." She looked at the clear water, at the reflection of the first stars shimmering on its surface. She thought of the gray, crowded cities of the east, of the dying river of her childhood. Then she looked at the vast, open land around her, a land of harsh beauty and hard-won peace. She looked at the man standing beside her, a man who was as much a part of this landscape as the red mesas and the ancient, enduring water. "I do not think so," she said softly. "I think I have finally found the place I was looking for, all along." A change in the air, a subtle shift in the breeze, drew their attention to the sky. A single, dark cloud, heavy with the promise of the first seasonal rains, was drifting in from the west, as if in response. A fat drop of rain landed on the stone in Willa's hand. Then another, They watched as the surface of the spring dimpled with the falling drops. The clear water seemed to swell, just for a moment, the level rising a fraction of an inch against the banks. It was as if the land itself, healed and whole again, had taken a deep, contented breath. The rain that had washed the valley clean became a promise. It was the first of the season, and it was followed by days of clear, bright sunlight that seemed to scrub the memory of smoke and fear from the air. The land, so long parched and tense, began to soften. A faint blush of green appeared on the hillsides, and the water in Coyote Springs ran with a new, confident energy. The work of healing was not left to nature alone. The people of the valley, in an unspoken agreement, began to build. They did not build new walls to divide themselves, but a single, low wall of carefully chosen river stones to protect the mouth of the spring, a permanent guardian against any future threat. It was slow, heavy work. Ranchers who had once looked upon their Navajo neighbors with suspicion now worked shoulder to shoulder with them, lifting and placing the heavy stones. Jed Crow, his old bones moving with a new purpose, directed the work with the practiced eye of a man who understood the language of rock and water. Ada Morales brought wagons of food and drink, turning the work site into a daily gathering, a place where a community was being built as surely as the stone embankment. Sheriff Choate, a man transformed by his own brief cowardice, supervised the placement of the new illegally binding survey markers, his presence a guarantee that this time the law would stand on the side of justice. A communal water station was constructed, a simple wooden structure with a trough for livestock and a clean, shaded area for people, a tangible symbol that the lifeblood of the valley belonged to everyone. Willa found a small, abandoned cabin on a piece of land overlooking the spring. With help from Jed and Kai, she repaired the roof and patched the walls. It was not much, but it was a home. She swept the wide front porch clean and set up a long plank table with 2 benches. It was here that she began her new school. Her students were a small, mixed group. The children of the ranchers sat beside the children of the Navajo, their heads bent over the same slates, learning the same letters and numbers. They learned in English, and in the afternoons. Sheila would come and sit on the porch steps, teaching them the dying words for the sky, the water, and the earth. Jed Crow, in his own quiet way, created a monument to the peace they had won. He gathered the empty brass cartridges from the brief, chaotic gunfight at the spring. He drilled a small hole in the base of each one and strung them together with strips of leather. He hung the finished piece from the eaves of Ada's store. It was a wind chime. In the afternoon breeze, the shells made a soft, hollow music, a gentle, metallic whisper. It is to remind us, he told anyone who asked, that the guns are sleeping now. The future between Willa and Kai was something they built in the same way the community was rebuilding the valley slowly, carefully, with a shared understanding. There were no grand declarations, no promises of forever. Their bond was not a chain, but a path they chose to walk side by side. One evening, they stood together on the porch of her small cabin, watching the last light of day paint the mesas in strokes of orange and violet. "I am not the man I was," Kai said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet air. "I have walked in your world. I have used its laws and its weapons. Some among my people say I have strayed too far from the old ways." "And I am not the woman I was," Willa answered, looking out at the land that was now her home. "I came here seeking justice for one man's memory. I found a home for my own heart instead. Your world has taught me that a promise is not just a thing you keep for the dead, but a thing you build for the living." He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, steady light. "We do not own each other. Willa Hart." "No," she said, a soft smile touching her lips. "We do not. We just walk together." Their love story was written in these quiet moments, in the shared work of building a new life, in the easy silence that grew between them. It was a love that did not seek to rescue, but to support. A love that understood that true freedom was found not in possession, but in partnership. Weeks later, after the permanent legal protections for the spring had been signed and sealed at the county courthouse, and the last remnants of McGraw's work train had been hauled away, they found themselves once again at the water's edge. The sun had set, and a full moon was rising, casting a path of liquid silver across the surface of the pool. The air was cool and still. The land was at peace. Willa looked at their reflection in the water, two figures standing close, yet distinct. She felt a wave of emotion so pure, so profound, that it left her breathless. It was the feeling of a long and dangerous journey finally ending, of a soul finding its rightful harbor. All the fear, the running, the fighting, had led them to this single, perfect moment of stillness. She turned to him, her face illuminated by the soft moonlight. "I have never been this close to a man," she whispered, the words an echo of that stormy night in the cave. But this time, they were not a confession of fear, but a declaration of peace. He smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers, strong and warm. "You already are," he said, his voice as soft as the desert wind. "And you will always be, when you choose to stand beside me." He did not pull her closer. He did not need to. In his words, in his touch, was the quiet promise of a lifetime. A promise not of ownership, but of unwavering companionship. A promise that home was not a roof over your head, but the person who stood with you when the storm came, and the person who shared the quiet beauty of the moonlight after the storm had passed. They stood together for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast, benevolent sky. Two people made whole by a love as patient, as enduring, and as life-giving as the water that murmured at their feet. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales, like this video, and press the hype button to help this story be heard by more people.